In this episode of the Anticipate podcast, we explore unconscious bias within organisations and the impact that it can have. Sherry Aitchison, Global Director of Diversity, Equality and Inclusion at Peakon, Maria Mansour, Head of HR for Ramboll Middle East and Asia Pacific, and Nicolina Camino Ibecan, Professor of Human Resource Management and Diversity at Zayed University, join us to discuss unconscious bias training and whether it can help trigger a fundamental change. Welcome to the WSP Diversity and Inclusion podcast. I am delighted to be joined today by three extremely experienced professionals from multiple industries and backgrounds. I'd like to first introduce Nicolina Camino Ibecan, Professor of Human Resource Management and Diversity at Zayed University. Secondly, I am joined by Maria Mansour, Head of HR for Ramboll Middle East and Asia Pacific, where her strategic focus areas are diversity, inclusion, and talent management. I am also very pleased to welcome Sherry Aitchison, who is the Director of Diversity, Equality and Inclusion at Peakon, an employee engagement platform, and much more. Sherry is a multi-award-winning author, ambassador and speaker, and also brings experience from working with online challenger bank Monzo and consultancy Deloitte. So welcome to all three of you. We're here together today to really explore the role of unconscious bias and what we mean by that. How should organisations respond to unconscious bias in the workplace in terms of training and strategy? And how might we make a fundamental shift in having more workplaces adopt a more inclusive culture? So I'd like to start with asking each of you, what does bias mean to you? And how has it impacted your experience? How does it show up in your work experience? Cherie.
Bias to me means when we make short-circuited and assumption-based decisions. For me, it's really about us jumping the gun, about taking a short circuit or a shortcut to the decision that we need to make without actually sitting back, analysing the processes around us, analysing the actual situations we're in, and how our decisions may impact people outside of those we directly and indirectly identify with. The really key part here is that biases play a huge role, not just in the workplace, but actually in everything that we do, how we work every day, but actually how we live every day, how we live with our families, the way we communicate with each other, who we deem worthy of listening to and who we decide we don't want to listen to. And that's why this plays such an important role, that we really actively understand not just unconscious bias, but actually unchecked bias as well. The biases that we know exist, but we don't challenge because we are probably privileged enough not to.
Thank you, Cherie. And over to you, Nicolina.
For me, bias, as the other speakers have said, it's about we stereotype. So we have preconceived ideas about an individual based on typically their social group membership. So maybe their gender, their ethnicity, their nationality, and so on. And I think an issue, a fundamental issue in the workplace is that bias can actually have a material effect on someone's employment opportunities and career development. So in terms of who we consider capable to do a job, who we consider committed to their job, who we see as having higher chances of, like a linear career model. There's a lot of stereotyping there, for example, in terms of gender, that women may have career breaks, maternity leave, that may create a situation where some groups are more advantaged than others.
Thank you, Nicolina. It's really interesting both you and Cherie touch on this idea of decisions being made unconsciously, suggesting that we really need to become conscious of the opinions and decisions that are often predetermined and should be reconsidered or reprogrammed with the context of each individual and each situation in mind. I just love the way you describe it as a shortcut to the conclusion. And I think, just to turn to you, Maria, in a workplace context, where do you see bias? Where does it show up for you?
Thank you. So I think it shows up in our policies, in our processes, and the many different things and activities that we do. If I look at it from an HR context, we have the employee life cycle where we have lots of different touch points where, bias can come in and actually play quite a significant role in how we make decisions. So that's definitely, those are the areas where we have to focus more on where bias exists, and how to look at eliminating some of that in order to have more awareness around it, and to have a process which is more open-minded in that sense.
Thanks, Maria. And that raises a really interesting point. We are all aware of the fact that bias may exist, and I think it would be impossible nowadays to not be aware of this and the consequences of it. However, where the challenge seems to come is, what do organisations do about it? Organisations often turn to unconscious bias training as, shall I say, a quick fix or just perhaps a place to start. But from your experience, Maria, how far did unconscious bias training really go for your organisation? And were you able to use it as an effective tool?
So we've carried out unconscious bias training in different and various parts of the organization, and I think it's a good start. It's a way to sort of raise awareness and make people more conscious of the decisions that they make. But I think it's also important for us to manage the expectations around unconscious bias training, because that's only a start, and there is so much work that needs to be done after the training happens. Um,
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, just to turn to you, Cherie, so when you described all of those contextual factors that lead to those shortcuts in decision making, it's impossible to think that an unconscious bias, a single event or a training event could resolve all of that. So when leaders come to Peakon or to you as a consultant and ask you, where do we start? What would your advice be about, where to begin and how far unconscious bias can take you?
Yeah, of course. And to echo what Maria has said, unconscious bias training is a singular point in time process or exercise to kick off where we're at. How I describe it is, we need people to move from awareness into education into action, that three-stage process, and it's a circular cycle process. It doesn't stop at one and then you're finished, but it's continuous. And with unconscious bias training, the process here is we want people to start being aware of what's happening outside of their own lived experience, around their own piece of how they live in the world and the places that they live, the different class backgrounds they may be from, intersecting with race, gender, disability, and so on. What's really important is actually, how do you measure the success of unconscious bias training? And this is where a lot of organizations fall and fail, because they don't measure it. They assume that because people will go on the training, that therefore they will want to make change. Now, that's not how the world works. This is not why we're in a situation where we have all of us on this call who are quite literally experts in the fields that we're in, working to fix these things. What we need to do is actually be really clear about what success looks like from unconscious bias training. Now, a Peakon, for example, as a tool that allows organizations to measure inclusion, what we do is really understanding, if a certain group of leaders are put on unconscious bias training, should their scores around and the employee perceptions to responsiveness, to non-discrimination, to management support get better? The answers are yes, those scores should get better, especially when you break them down from, let's say, how women feel, how men feel, how people from different backgrounds, etc. feel. And that's the real clear piece here that's missing is, okay, you run an exercise, great, but actually, what do you do to check it's successful? But also, if you find that it isn't successful, how do you deal with that? What are the interventions that you must have in place with those leaders potentially that aren't taking this on board?
Absolutely, and I think the context of that is important as well. So what going on the training on its own is one thing, but the whole context of the organisation and the checking, let's say, or the metric of it is the strategic drive behind it. And I think Nicolina, that just asked me to turn to you and say, in all of the research that you see, where is it successful? When is it most successful that you can fundamentally have a slightly more inclusive or a fundamentally more inclusive workplace? What needs to be there beyond just bias training?
Thank you, Caroline. I think if I could go back just one step before I answer that, I think a key part that perhaps, there are issues or pitfalls with the training, and I'm not suggesting at all that we just bash it and throw it out. There could be positive aspects of it if it's done properly. But the key issue is that we cannot assume that even if the training is done successfully, that everyone will suddenly, become champions for equality. There are people that may actively resist it because they are in privileged positions. So there are people that don't want to change the status quo. And in terms of your question about when it has been more successful, I think research generally indicates that these kind of training programs are successful when they're part of a broader initiatives to really challenge the systemic issues and institutional discrimination. So fundamentally reviewing structures, systems, organizational culture, as well as policies. And research has also indicated that there are additional components. So it's not just your time in the training. Key career development factors include having an influential mentor that really supports your career development, being part of an influential network that supports your development. And again, we know that some groups may be directly or indirectly disadvantaged. For example, research indicates that people tend to mentor people that resemble themselves. So that's often very unconscious, and it's more to do with comfort level. So unless we really challenge these things, same with networking, some networking events indirectly may affect people with children. And typically we know that it's women more than men that take care of the home and domestic and childcare responsibilities. So indirectly, if we don't question the overall structure and organizational culture, things won't change. So it's about having programs such as this, but at the same time challenging the structural and cultural issues of the organization.
Thanks, Nicolina. And you touched on something there, and I'm going to ask you, Maria. So, from your experience, the idea of resistance to bias, I imagine most leaders would never actively resist it, but perhaps unconsciously resist it, to your point, from comfort, for example. So, I wonder, Maria, what would you say to other HR leaders who face resistance like that?
I think it's actually really important for us as HR, in like many of the other things that we have to roll out and get pushback on, is the linkage to business and what it will bring and the return of investment to business. I think that's where we will get the attention of business leaders, and they will understand why this is so important. Because yes, while it's important from an ethical perspective, it also has a huge impact on business success, especially in the world that we're currently in. So we need to ensure that the gap that frequently exists between what HR wants to push through and roll out and what business sees as important is bridged. And that's really the only way we can make sure that we get the attention and the buy-in from leaders, and that they also walk the talk when it comes to EDI.
And Cherie, from your experience, what can HR and leaders do, business leaders, when they really face a resistance, consciously or unconsciously, to inclusion?
Before we even move into the actions of what we all leaders and HR leaders should and can do, I think it's really important to recognise that there are people that will resist to this, not because it's uncomfortable but because they want to resist to it. And we have to accept that a big part of this work is acknowledging that there are people that are actively against and detracting EDI work. And so in Peakon, we have the world's largest standardized data set. And what we saw last year was a significant uprise and uptick in comments around inclusion and specifically racial inclusion. But what we also seen is that 1 in 10 of those comments were from white people specifically voicing resistance to change. So these people do exist. They aren't just resisting to change because of uncomfortableness, but actually because of very serious ingrained discriminatory biased reasons. Now, what's really important here for HR leaders and for leaders in general to do is be very transparent about where they are at right now. What we can't do is move forward on a footing that suggests that we can make everything okay without recognizing where we're at from an inclusion perspective and a diversity demographic representation perspective. Both of those things must exist together, and your reporting must connect in that way. Otherwise, you view diversity representation as a success metric of inclusion, and it's not singularly by itself. The second thing is the lines of accountability. Who is accountable for this work? why and how. Now the work, the responsibility of the strategy and delivery and so on will probably sit with someone like me, the global director of DE&I or VP or whatever it might be. But actually the actual ownership as well also must be displaced across your business leaders too. That sense of accountability and what they must change in their areas. And then the third thing is actually the metrics piece. How do you measure success? What will you do when you aren't successful, and how will you talk about that? We need organizations and leaders to really move forward in how they do this work with transparency and accountability at its core.
Thanks, Cherie. Some fantastic points there. One of the other factors we need to consider is the business case. So it's often cited that there is a business case for diversity and inclusion, but for organisations to leverage this, they need to consider whether or not their leaders tolerate resistance. Because if you're truly passionate and your purpose is to have an inclusive workplace, you can't, as you're saying, Cherie, force it onto people. If it's not fundamentally in who they are, which is really important. I mean, if you're going to have an ultimate goal towards a diverse and inclusive workplace, you do need your leaders to really have that as part of who they are, to be a goal that they share. So I was just going to move on to another set of questions on leaders again. So when leaders are the most successful, Cherie, you've touched on it, and Maria, you touched on it as well. They drive for it and they bring their teams along with them. But it's a huge agenda. I mean, it's really a huge agenda to look at. So, what are the things leaders have to really say clearly to their organization? And I'll just ask you, Nicolina, again, from your experience, what are the things that leaders really need to be absolutely clear about when they set out on a journey to become a more inclusive workplace? So I was just going to move on to another bucket of questions on leaders again. So, when leaders are the most successful, Cherie, you've touched on it, and also Maria, you touched on it as well. They drive for it and they bring their teams along with them. But it's a huge agenda. It's a huge agenda to look at. So, what are the things that leaders really have to say clearly to their organization? And I'll just ask you, Nicolina, again, from your experience, what are the things that leaders really need to be absolutely clear about when they set out on a journey to become a more inclusive workplace?
I think partly we can link this back to obviously really practicing what they're preaching and engaging diverse workforce in all areas of their work, not just recruiting at junior levels to, sometimes tick the box, but actively supporting relevant training, fair performance management processes, and career progression. And I think what was mentioned earlier about, the business case, I think it's important for leaders to advocate for the business case for diversity, to actually state that they believe in the idea of having a diverse workforce can increase creativity and it can improve the performance of the organization. And there's a lot of research to support that. At the same time, however, and my own research has indicated that multiple times, there may be instances that there is no business case for diversity, or you cannot always prove a business case. When I was doing some research in the UK for some smaller organizations, they would argue for us it wouldn't make a big difference if we have more women or if we have ethnic minority people. Rightly or wrongly, that was at least the perception. And sometimes it's hard to prove a business case. Other research has also indicated that there are a lot of challenges with having a culturally diverse workforce or diverse workforce of any kind. That does not mean you shouldn't strive for it, but you have to accept that there are going to be a lot of challenges. So as a leader, you can engage more with a 3-level approach. So you could advocate for the business case, but also support and be confident to state that we should be promoting diversity because we should. It's the right thing to do. So the moral case, the social justice argument, and be unapologetic about that. So it's not always selling this business case, like this is the only reason. And lastly, the last component of that would be firm around legislation and policies. Based on what Cherie was saying earlier and what I've said before when you asked me about unconscious bias, we know some people will resist it. We know there's privilege, that some people want to maintain the status quo. So showing as a leader that you're ready to take action against people that are not supportive of diversity, both internally in terms of your own organizational policies, but also in terms of the legislation available in the context you're in, is quite important. So I would say it's a combination of the business case, moral case, and legal case.
Thank you, Nicolina. And Maria, from a practitioner's experience, what's your response to this?
What I wanted to mention is that I think it's really important for leaders to, again, set the expectations of what business can expect, of what staff can expect, and also be very clear on what is acceptable and not acceptable. And of course, that needs to be in line with what the company line is on EDI. But I think also actively walk the talk in everything that we do as leaders, and going back to the policies, processes, etc. But I think it's, while we're talking about this as a top down process, it also needs to have engagement bottom up. We need people to really understand and engage as well in the rest of the organization. So it should not just be a top down exercise.
Maria, that's a fantastic point you make about it not just being a top down exercise. And as Nicolina mentioned, the business case might be difficult to make, but if leaders believe in the moral case and they push to talk about it, we can use that as a catalyst for change. The moral case for this adds an interesting element. As a HR practitioner, I know that for all the policies in the world, if the culture doesn't have it at its core and it's not in the core of the organization, the policies don't work. It's our responsibility to be inclusive and diverse, and I can certainly see that for the new generation of employees, it's an expectation, almost a non negotiable part of the company you want to work for. And I wonder, Cherie, do you see that in the research with Peakon as well?
Yeah, absolutely. We are seeing that people are expecting more and demanding more of current, and certainly in our data set, current employees are demanding more of their organizations on diversity, equity, and inclusion. But what I also seen recently was research that had shown particularly Gen Z and millennials are demanding more when it comes to the application process and the hiring process on diversity and inclusion. And what they're demanding is, firstly, to have very clear and concise, externally facing reporting and so on what is happening in your organization around inclusion, and also that the hiring managers, the people that you're interfacing with in that process, must be able to answer those questions in a way that is transparent, accountable, and clean cut. And when they don't get appropriate answers or appropriate lines of accountability for this work, they don't want to work there. And we have a generation of people, and generations, plural, of people that are able to move around. We have a global talent process that allows people to move around and pick the jobs that really align to them. So when organizations don't step up, you cannot expect to hire the best talent because you're not meeting the needs that they need. And there's a great connection here that we see, especially in the evolution of employee and potential employee needs in the last year around remote working, around flexible working, around what that means from a process perspective, as opposed to just saying, oh, yes, you can work anywhere. But actually, from a logistical perspective, what does that mean from a regional perspective? What does that mean from the policies that you share externally? What does it mean in practice? And we're seeing the same things across all of this. People want more, and they won't work at your organization if you're not going to deliver.
Thanks, Cherie. And that just says to this the comments that Nicolina was saying about there isn't always a clear business case. So perhaps the evident business case isn't there today, but you have to look to the future and say, well, who will be the future of my organization? And they will demand it of me. And that drives a business case, perhaps different to the more traditional expectation of a financial or otherwise business case. So I think they're great insights. And Maria, I can see something that you'd like to add in this space.
Yeah, exactly. So I echo what I want to echo what Cherie has said and build on to that by saying I think Gen Z and millennials are looking at having a bigger purpose that's very important for them, and so I think the lines are getting blurred between strictly what business does and what we do in our personal lives. And I think that is also a point that we need to consider, that business as a whole is part of society and doesn't exist in a vacuum. What we do in businesses has an impact on society. And so we're not just talking about a job, we're talking about the bigger picture here. And I think that's where we, as organizations and businesses, also need to lead by example, but also walk the talk. And in that way, also attract people who want to be part of an organization that focuses on the bigger picture. And I think that is going to be the future of business.
So, just to round off this podcast, we set off to explore unconscious bias, our awareness of unconscious bias in organizations and the impact that has, but also to start to ideate about what are the fundamental things that can shift us forward. And just reflecting on everything we've said, it's evident this agenda is huge. I think all of us know that. And I think when leaders are sitting looking at their organization, trying to work out how do I move from where I am to where I'd like to get to, it's understandably a huge agenda, and they need to turn to experts in HR and experts in diversity and inclusion for support. I think one of the most apparent things of this discussion is clearly unconscious bias training is a good thing. It's a starting point, but the whole organization has to follow along that journey. The whole organization has to buy into it. And as some of you mentioned, it's about the wider society and it's about the future generations of talent. To your point, Sherry, it has to be something that we're all pushing for together. And just as you said, Maria, from every level of the organization, this isn't something we can solve through sitting in a boardroom or writing policies. The organization has to fundamentally have this as a driver towards somewhere else they want to be or something they want to grow more of. So I'd just like to finish by asking on behalf of the leaders who might be listening to this podcast, what would you say to them in terms of where to go next? And I'll ask you first, Sherry.
Sure. What I would suggest is be transparent throughout this process. What we don't need is a lack of transparency, because that means a lack of accountability. What we need you to do is to be very honest, do the analysis to understand where you are at so you can very clearly articulate and define where you want to go. Be transparent about the successes that you may have along the way, but also about the lessons learned that you will have, because you will have them. Everything you do will not be correct, and you should be very open about that, because it is important that we focus on this from a wider societal perspective. One organization fixing this isn't what we need. We need everybody to fix this, and remember that you play a role in that wider piece.
Thanks, Sherry. And Nicolina, from you.
Yeah, just building on from what Cherie said, transparency is really important. And I think having KPIs, having measurements, so some metrics would be important, because if it's not measured, as we know, nothing can really be done. So some clear and simple metrics should be sufficient. How many women have been employed, but also which positions? How long did it take them to get promoted? Pay gap, gender pay gap is a huge issue, but being able to be willing as an organization to have transparency and showing that data is really important. The race pay gap as well, nationality in the UAE, we know that's in the UAE that's a huge issue. Because it's almost taken for granted that different nationalities can be paid differently. So measurement, some sort of metrics, KPIs, I would say would be central to moving forward.
Thanks, Nicolina. And finally, Maria, from you, what would be your advice to leaders and HR leaders?
Yeah, I think what's important here is also to see this as a focus on improving relationships, because that's what it's all about, right? It's all about creating a safe and open space for conversations and for successes. So it's all about improving our relationships with our staff, with our businesses, with talent, etc.
Thanks, Maria. If leaders are prepared to make the choice to challenge and take more risk and do things that are not the usual, if they create teams that don't all look the same and think differently, then they are taking steps in the right direction towards a more inclusive workplace. So thank you, everybody. Thank you for a great discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.